Time travel in fiction is very weird. For most things you write, you'll find that readers and audiences are pretty accepting about all sorts of fantastical stuff you throw their way. As long as you keep the rules consistent in the world, people will just accept it. Your spaceships go faster than light because they warp? Sure. There are rings with innate magical power, and this one in particular is the most evil and must be destroyed in Mount Doom? Makes sense to me. But time travel? It's always judged based on our own intuitions about it. I think it's because we have a frame of reference already for most things, even if very fictional. We don't have faster than light space travel, but we do have ships and planes as well as some experience in space. We can put it together in our heads and rationalize it. Even magic, we can frame it as either persons or objects that have strange power or curses or something. Humans have had such concepts for thousands of years in mythology and folklore. But time travel. We don't even have good fictional explanations for it. There's nothing really to base it on other than itself. It's also too inconsistent. Every time travel story has to account for time travel in an entirely new way. Doctor Who's time travel isn't like Back to the Future's. Tennant's isn't like Bill and Ted's. Time travel is undoubtedly a genre with expectations, but what those expectations consist of are vague. The question quickly becomes, is a time travel story worth the effort of having to develop an entirely original set of rules and explanations? Well, the answer to that question is mostly up to you. My goal today is to talk about it in a way that can give you the things to think about and use to judge your own work. You'll have to forgive me for how much speculation I have to do. Time travel tends to be highly unrecommended by people who teach creative writing, so I don't have as much material in my notes to go off of as other, more universal parts of fiction. The first and most obvious thing to consider are paradoxes. The funny thing about reality is that it never seems to have unanswerable paradoxes. Every time one comes up, we eventually find an answer to it. But oh boy do they appear in fiction. Still, even amateur writers can find and fix the occasional character accidentally teleporting or an in-world Mandela effect the writer didn't intend. Adding time travel is where it tends to get messy. The two most famous paradoxes I will talk about today are the grandfather paradox and the bootstrap paradox. These are the two that are so well known that committing them will be absolutely noticed by readers and audiences, so try your absolute hardest to avoid them. First up is the grandfather paradox. David Lewis has a paper that talks about it at length in the context of metaphysics. Let's not get that deep. The TLDR is if Tim goes back in time to kill his grandfather in 1923, but Tim's dad isn't born until 1930, and Tim knows his grandfather didn't die until 1945, then he can't really kill grandfather. Something has to happen because it already has. Killing the grandfather means Tim doesn't exist, but if Tim doesn't exist, then he can't kill his grandfather, so his grandfather lives long enough for Tim to be born, and so on. Some metaphysicians might argue that's not the point. My point is, do something that violates this paradox, and your readers will absolutely notice. You don't want that. The issue extends quite a bit more than you might think, too. Let's say your protagonist's parents meet because they're imprisoned from a war, and your protagonist goes back in time and prevents the war from happening at all. Any excuse those two parents still meet and had your protagonist will not only feel cheap, but broken, because even if your protagonist exists, they have no incentive to go back in time and stop the war. The loop continues. The bootstrap paradox is the next one most people will notice. My favorite way it's been described is in a monologue in Doctor Who.
Google it.
But look it up after this video. I need the watch time more than the BBC. Anyway, the way it's most traditionally described is if a man spends his entire adult life designing and building a time machine. When he finishes it, he is in his late 80s and realizes he can't enjoy it. So he goes back in time and gives the finished time machine to his teenage self. The problem? If his teenage self has the completed time machine, then he never designs and builds it, so the time machine can't exist. To explain it the Doctor Who way, imagine a guy with a time machine. He loves the music of Ludwig van Beethoven and brings all of his sheet music for the composer to sign, but when he gets there, he discovers that Beethoven seems to not exist. Panicking, the time traveler copies all of the sheet music and has it published under the name Ludwig van Beethoven, and history goes on untouched. But who originally put those notes together? Most paradoxes work in the same way. Time travel fiction is the most likely to run into them. After all, stories operate on cause and effect, and time travel can create effects being their own causes very easily if you let them. You want your stories to be interesting, and you know characters would be interested in meeting people important to them, and that can cause vicious loops. Now, a comedy might not necessarily have that issue if you satirize the paradox. The issue is, it's been done already quite a bit. If you want something original or serious, managing your local paradoxes will be critical. The next thing to consider is your world building. Time travel is impossible, and in a strange way, more impossible than other impossibilities in our imaginations. We can fit most sci-fi and magic into logic systems, not time travel. Because of that, you'll need some good justifications for it, but thankfully your audience should kinda cut you some slack on the details. Just make sure you have those details. Let's look at Back to the Future. Doc Brown made a time machine out of a DeLorean. It has a flux capacitor, 88 miles per hour, 1.21 gigawatts. Is any of that real? Well, I guess DeLoreans are, but you get the point. As I've said numerous times before, we relate to detail, not ambiguity. The readers don't have to know why those are the rules if the rules seem reasonable. Like, the whole concept would have fallen apart if Doc Brown said something like, oh, and when you get to 88 miles per hour, you have to sneeze for it to switch on. It would be unreasonable. We can't connect what sneezing has to do with any of this. Plot is where things get whack. In any story that isn't time travel related, you can comfortably rely on causes happening before effects. Even plot structure itself does that. The inciting incident, which brings the protagonist in, will naturally have to come before the climax where the protagonist completes the journey. With a time travel narrative, plot structure must remain consistent. You know, perhaps the climax happens in the world before the inciting incident, but the protagonist has to experience the inciting incident first. Except, you might have bootstrap paradoxed it. The inciting incident sent the protagonist to go settle something in the past, which means the inciting incident didn't happen, so the protagonist didn't have a need to time travel. I told you this was tricky. So, surely there must be solutions, right? Well, there are, actually. One thing you can do to make writing a time travel story easier is to only travel forwards in time. Cause and effect paradoxes only occur when the effects come before the causes. If your time travel story only involves hopping to the future, then that's not really an issue. Your immediate reaction might be characters in the present going into the future, but you can even have characters from the distant past come into the present. In other words, future exclusive time travel isn't very restricting. Another benefit is increased stakes. Any action your character makes that is non-reversible is going to really help the drama of your story. The next way to do it is to make sure the fictional world doesn't let time travel be easy. If characters can just blink around without issue, the story will simply not get off the ground. Your protagonist needs some kind of price to pay for every jump. Maybe their location is revealed to the antagonist every time, or maybe it takes an enormous amount of energy and is not always available. Another option is that the time traveler can't fully control their destination with certainty. The point is, time travel is way too powerful to just let your protagonist use it as they please. The third option is to simply ignore it. As you might have noticed from how different every time travel story is and how many of them simply disregard any logic base whatsoever, it's also possible to just accept time travel as a ridiculous concept and will never truly obtain fully in any story. It's pretty much the only hocus pocus in fiction that can be handled like that. Everything from magic to space travel usually needs a few different layers of detail to work. Time travel can almost be hand-waved because of how incoherent the notion of traveling through time is to our everyday conventions. Now, I do still strongly recommend developing it, but strictly speaking, I've seen people get away with not doing that. Now, one truth about time travel fiction that cannot be violated is that time travel can never be added to a world or story that was 1. Not originally designed for time travel, and 2. Not centrally focused on time travel. In other words, sudden time travel does not work and background time travel does not work. If it's not front and center, then it fails. Take, for example, the 2009 Star Trek movie. Some people apparently took offense to what I said about it, but my main point about the movie is that the plot is completely jumbled. Time travel is what I blame for a lot of it. It's handled very inconsistently, which ruins its own tension. Additionally, Star Trek is not time travel fiction. It's not a world equipped to handle it properly. You dumb fucks, I hear some of you say. Star Trek has had time travel before, and people liked it. Listen, I admit The Voyage Home is fun, and I even have my VHS copy, but the only reason the movie is good at all is because it was very self-aware. It knew the comedic gap to exploit in the socio-economic differences between the world of Star Trek and the real-life 1980s, but it also knew how to handle it in a way that makes sense for the characters. In other words, the story takes the mission as seriously as ever, but uses comedy to make sure the audience is up to speed. If they took it too seriously, the time travel would have torn this movie apart. If they didn't take it seriously at all, the movie would have felt more like a parody of Star Trek than an actual Star Trek movie, because Star Trek has always tried to strike a balance between drama and comedy. Arguably, the most famous time travel story also seems to ignore most of the associated rules. Doctor Who. Since its inception in 1963, Doctor Who has been a continuity nightmare. What is and isn't canon seems to be constantly up in the air, other than a few things writers have generally agreed to keep vague. Still, Doctor Who seems to be a franchise that can get away with anything. The reason is mostly because continuity is mostly focused on keeping things consistent within the same showrunner's term limit, while still using things from previous showrunners when applicable. It also helps that the Doctor regenerates, which means the character can be refreshed and updated as needed without making the show weird. Still, little of that has to do with time travel itself. For the most part, the show's episodic cycle is the Doctor arriving at a place and time, and then doing something there. Episodes where time travel happens throughout the episode is mainly reserved for special ones like pilots, finales, or holidays, which is how I think the show holds itself together. Each smaller story can have its own cause and effect chains, and the final results of each become the cause and effect chain for the entire season. By keeping the movement in time controlled, the time travel aids the story instead of hindering it. Therefore, the real lesson might be much simpler than even I anticipated before writing all of this. Maybe the key to writing good time travel fiction isn't to solve time travel, but rather to make the rules of your own world and story, as well as the development of your own characters, strong enough to patch the logical holes inherent in all notions of time travel. I guess there's only one way to find out. Keep writing.